Without further ado, I want to get us into our first speaker and setting the scene on day one. Today is all about exploring the challenging context. It's amazing to think since we last met in 2022 just how much the world has changed. When we last gathered, ChatGPT wasn't a thing. We didn't have so many of the geopolitical twists and turns that we've seen taking place over the landscape. Today we're going to get into all of that rich and challenging context, setting the scene tomorrow for a conversation about how do we as leaders navigate this complicated contour of landscape and find our way out towards the prosperity of the energy future we all want to realise. To set the scene for us and kick us off, a familiar face for those of you who have attended Energy Disruptors before, Peter Tertzakian is joining us. Peter is an energy economist, an author, an entrepreneur, and a podcaster. He's the founder of the ARC Energy Research Institute at Studio Energy, and he's got more than 35 years' experience in the business of energy, from oil and gas right the way through to renewables. He's also, since we last saw him, founded Studio Energy, an initiative dedicated to mentoring the next generation of leaders, something we're very passionate here at Energy Disruptors about, hoping to address the world's most complex energy challenges. Without further ado, for the first time today, can you give a very warm Energy Disruptors welcome to Peter Tertzakian?
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor. I'm truly humbled to be asked to open up the third Disruptors here in Calgary. And for the third time, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the champions of Energy Disruptors, Holly, Graham, Michelle. It's just an incredible effort to put on a show like this. It's more than a show. It's a public service. It's a public service to Calgary, to bring the world here to talk about energy. It's a public service to the world to talk about the energy and the challenges that we face, and you're going to hear about over the course of the next couple days at this amazing conference. So thank you to you three once again. We want to acknowledge you for this tremendous effort. Thank you. All right, well, as the opening act here, I'd like to offer you some of my reflections on the theme of this year's Energy Disruptors Conference. I want to give you my reflections over my career and my historical learnings about the ingredients for successful energy transitions. So let's get right at it. The theme this year is Unite, accelerating the energy transition through unlikely collaboration. What I like to do when I go to a conference is look at the title and try and invert it to try and understand, like, the problem statement, why we're here. Why is it that we're here? So without sounding patronizing to the organizers, I'm going to pick apart the theme for this year's conference. So here's energy transition, wind turbine and some oil tanks. Okay, so the notion is accelerating. That's one of the themes in that, one of the phrases in that title. Energy transition. Unite, bringing people together in this unusual term called unlikely collaboration, giving us a sense that maybe people are loath to come together and therefore we do need to unite. All right, well, let me invert the theme to understand the problem statement. Energy transition is not happening fast enough because stakeholders are siloed in their discussions, giving reference to this notion of unlikely collaborations between people who are in disparate groups. And they're polarized in their beliefs. In other words, that collaboration is required to bring them together, but that there's some sense of disunion in that. All right, well, this is a very human thing, and I don't think that it's necessary to be too apologetic about the fact that as human beings, we need to be united to bring the people together to collaborate more. And so I take you back to one of my personal heroes, Mr. Thomas Edison, who I would argue is one of the most influential figures in the history of transition, period, and energy transition. Mr. Edison transitioned us to audio recordings, to movies, and of course, most notably and famous for the light bulb and therefore the electrical grid, which he also championed. So important to understand the lessons that Mr. Edison imparted, because today one of the big themes of energy transition is electrification. So clearly we should go back and get some thoughts from the master of electrification. Mr. Edison is quoted as saying, "Nothing is more difficult in the world than to get a good many hundreds of thousands or millions of people to do something they have never done before." Let me read that again. Nothing is more difficult in the world than to get a good many hundreds of thousands or millions of people to do something they have never done before. Note that Mr. Edison, who had a laboratory of hundreds of staff, he's not saying nothing is more difficult in the world than to invent or to innovate or to make technology. Mr. Edison is talking about a very human thing, to get people to change, to get them to do something never done before, a reference to the adoption of the inventions that he is commercializing. Mr. Edison, as I said, is most famed for his light bulb. This is a picture of his original light bulb, one of which is in my personal collection, a very eclectic collection of antique light bulbs. I've stylized it in this artwork to reflect a moment in time in 1878 when Mr. Edison, who was also a showman, presented the first light bulb to a group of media, to a group of journalists. And the New York Herald article, which you can still find online, the author, the journalist said, "Those who have seen the invention pronounce it wonderful." In other words, we have something here. And indeed, people were very excited by the notion of getting off gas lighting and candles, kerosene lamps, and trying something new, though, as I said, this was only the first step in trying to get people to do something they have never done before. But there is a prerequisite in getting some excitement going. Well, 140 years later, we take lighting and street lighting, lighting everywhere, lighting on me, as something for granted. And 140 years later, we have transitioned from that simple filament bulb to LED lighting. But we do take it for granted, and we think it happened overnight. Now, I took this photo out of a plane flying over London, about to land in the evening. I encourage you also to, as I like to say, close your spreadsheets and just look out the window, because it gives you a sense of scale, of the magnitude of what we have to accelerate in terms of transition. It's not merely just swapping out incandescent light bulbs with LED light bulbs, but it's also things like looking out the window and saying, if we are to achieve net zero or other energy transition objectives, the scale of, say, retrofitting every single building as we look down, or as you look even around us in Calgary, is such a monumental task. 1902, by this time, the Edison Electric companies have now spawned off the famous General Electric, a light bulb, one of the most prized in my personal collection, the first metal filament bulb, the filament originally made from tantalum and later switched down to the element tungsten. This first metal filament bulb was indeed the catalyst. It provided the efficiency and the reliability of light bulbs to get that adoption going, to get people to do something they've never done before, and the rapid adoption and electrification began. But this is 1902, 24 years after the first experiment, giving us a sense that energy transition does not happen quickly. I celebrate my light bulb collection. I converted it into a series of pop art images. I chose the pop art medium because it really brings out the filament. And what one needs to understand in the evolution of the light bulb is the technology that went into the filament and its evolution, which ultimately led to the adoption of lighting and therefore electrification. It was showcased in a gallery, elevation gallery last summer, and by the way, it's coming back and is an elevation gallery again, and you're free to go visit it, but more on that later. I've got here the timeline of the history of the light bulb from the first experiments of Edison, and across the pond, Mr. Joseph Swan, who did the same thing in the UK. The evolution of lighting is really a fascinating study of 50 years of innovation. because it really wasn't until the 1920s that we actually had maturity enough in the light bulb for it to be adopted in a widespread basis. And it took then 100 years to get it to the next major innovation, which was LED lighting. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, okay, Peter, but innovation and technology changes much faster today. I won't necessarily debate that, but let me give you some other historical examples. 1905, also Mr. Edison was very fascinated by electric vehicles. And in his house organ publication, Bulletin of the New York Edison Company, was written, "The electric vehicle meets all the requirements of residents who understand it thoroughly." Well, I guess they didn't understand it thoroughly enough, because Mr. Henry Ford brought in the combustion engine vehicle, and we've been trying to commercialize the electric vehicle over the course of the last 100+ years. But here we are, a photo taken in 2020 with the electric charging stations in the back. And the question really is, do we understand it thoroughly enough today for adoption? I would say that this electric vehicle is roughly where the 1902 light bulb was, sort of in the midpoint range of that thing, and that the next iteration of battery technologies is really what's going to propel us forward. Note that that metal filament light bulb replaced the carbon-based filaments, which were made out, prior to that, filaments were made out of bamboo, they were made out of cotton fibers, carbonized cardboard, or paper. And so I think that the next generation of batteries will be somewhat equivalent to what we've seen, but all of which is to say that this takes time. And the question at hand at the conference is this notion of acceleration. What do we need to accelerate? The metal filament light bulb, 1902. This circa 1905, maybe 1902. Rural Alberta, just south of here by Longview. You can see a wind-powered pump. Maybe it's, I don't know, a kilowatt. 1985, if you've driven from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, you can see one of the earlier wind farms where each one of these is about 100 kilowatts. Some of the more recent ones are more. And then we evolved by 2020 to some of the larger turbines that we're accustomed to now, and the costs go down with scale, where each one of these is maybe 1,500, potentially 3,000 kilowatts and more. Okay, we get the sense that the evolution and technology, in many cases, can take even a century, although there are times of disruptive period where things accelerate rather rapidly. But let's move away from this notion of the time frame and the technology and just think about the way we are conditioned to understand energy transition. Okay, we've got upstream energy source, wind, solar, and now we're fortunate enough to take a boat ride in an offshore wind farm where now we've got up to potentially 15 megawatts of power coming off one of these things. And that we've got the electric vehicle on the right-hand side, which is the end use. No, the end use is not electric vehicle. The end use is mobility. And so to go from primary source of energy to moving around, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in between. Yet there's a sense that we sort of trivialize that. Oh, it's easy, plug and play. Let's just build the renewable energy on the back end and just plug in the vehicles or the new types of stoves and LED light bulbs on the back end. But when you flip that switch in the morning or put the electric vehicle into drive, you don't really fully appreciate all the stuff that happens in between. It's not an extension cord. It's extremely complicated infrastructure that has to be all repiped and rewired if we are to achieve the energy transition that we all seek. And if you actually look at where the money has gone over the course of the last 20 years, it's not even. Right? There's been about $10 trillion that's been spent, and I call it a barbell transition because greater than 40% of the dollars have been spent on renewables, primarily wind and solar, on the very upstream, and greater than 40% actually on electric vehicles and batteries, and these are high-value items. Actually, about 15% is all that's been spent in the middle. Yet, it's the middle that's the most complicated and expensive. And so one understands that there's a lot of work to be done. And how is it that we can get more being done in the middle? For example, even reconfiguring the heating in the millions of buildings that we would need to do. This is a complicated task, and I call this the mid-system investment deficit that we're facing. Now, I deal with a lot of the folks that make decisions about investing in these spaces, and sort of coined the phrase in my mind, like, no investment equals no transition. Right? Okay, now that's the extreme end. Now we are having some investment, as the slide shows. Right? But my experience over the course, particularly over the last 3-4 years, where I've made close to 100 presentations to big corporate boards and other management sessions, is this. Is that nothing is more difficult in the world than to get a few decision-making people to do something they have never done before. Because if we can't get these people to make the decisions, then, as I said, no investment equals no transition. And so the challenge is not so much in the wider society, but the challenge is actually amongst even a smaller group. Now, again, this is not an indictment. There's no fault. We're all human, including the people who sit around those tables. But there's a lot to juggle at tables like this. You can read through all the little bubbles that I've put on the screen there, whether it's the volatility and uncertainty of the capital markets or carbon markets, the geopolitics, interest rates, labor, so on. How do you put an assessment of price on these? In other words, the job of the person that sits around a table that makes multi-billion-dollar decision is to weigh risk and return. But if people can't understand what's being presented, then it's almost impossible to get a sense of quantification of risk and return. And the default, whether you're at the boardroom table or at your kitchen table, if you don't understand something, you're not going to put your money there. And this is a core and fundamental issue that I experience. And I experience it in 3 decision-making tables: the tables of business and corporate allocators of capital, the policymakers at government tables, the trading tables in the world of finance, or the investment committees. And if we put these 3 like this, because it's the intersection of the 3, that's where I like to play, is the intersection of 3. And I will tell you that it's a very difficult and dysfunctional space. Right? Spoiler alert, needs collaboration. I hope the people who sit at these tables are here. It's difficult and dysfunctional, but it's also exacerbated by what we have around us. As I said, there's a lot of balls to juggle, and I think we can all agree we're in an era of tremendous unease. So if I take those business policy and finance tables, and we overlay the social pressures and issues that we have, the economic uncertainties, environmental pressures, including certainly climate change, but not limited to climate change, technological change, and the ability to deal with a fast-paced changing world, politics and geopolitics, I think you'll agree it gets dark pretty quickly. In fact, it can go totally dark. We all hear about AI. We use AI. You're going to hear about AI on this stage. AI can be a tremendous productivity boost, an enabler, and on one hand, I'm very positive about it. But I think there are a lot of people, too, that feel unease in terms of what it does, for example, to labor markets, et cetera. But there's a broader thing that I think about when I sit at those boardroom tables and other tables where I have discussions, and that is that I don't know what or whom to trust anymore. I think we can agree with all the hallucinations and the deep fake audios, deep fake videos. It's just becoming a world where not only do I not understand what's being presented at the table, I don't even know whether I could trust it. And so what I'm getting at here is that it's difficult to make these kind of multi-billion-dollar decisions in the places that need to be made amidst the current situation. We can go back and say that this is nothing new, much like Mr. Edison's light bulb and inventions. You know, we've witnessed transitions before. Mr. Poe wrote in his story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, highly recommended reading, "Believe nothing you hear and only one half that you see." Now, I would argue, believe nothing you hear and nothing that you see. Okay, how do we make sense of it all? I certainly don't like to stand on a stage and be the battery half empty guy, right? We want to be battery half full and leave you with something and some sense of hope, because we're merely now just identifying the issues. Okay, how do we make sense of it all? Well, you've done the right thing, you're coming here. You're at the conference, you're going to see all sorts of amazing presentations, energy security, geopolitics, mining, financing, energy transition, so on and so forth. But is getting together and listening to talks on stage and networking outside merely sufficient conditions for effective collaborations that accelerate the transition? Well, I don't think it's a yes or no answer. Some people are effective at collaborating, and other groups maybe not so much. I don't want to be completely black or white about this, because the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. But I am going to give you my reflections of what it does take to accelerate a successful collaboration, which then in turn leads to better and easier decision-making and lubricate the boardroom and other tables, including the kitchen tables, for getting people to do something that they have never done before. Ingredients for unlikely collaborations. My number one rule over the course of my career that has evolved and developed and refined is simplify complexity. If people don't understand what you're talking about on the other side of the table, they just eyes glaze over, the phone comes out, and you start scrolling. Right? We know how it goes. Think holistically. We have a tendency to go down rabbit holes, as they say. You go down a rabbit hole, it's so hard to get out. You start arguing minutia down the rabbit hole. Bring it up many levels. Set context. Think holistically. And build trust. If you don't have trust at the table, then really you're not going to get very far. My experience is if you simplify complexity, make people understand what you're talking about, set the context, actually you do build the trust. So they're all interrelated, and we're trying to find that sweet spot in that intersection of the three. Let me talk to you about simplifying complexity and thinking holistically, and who better to talk to than Mr. Edison, or at least in a retrospective. The idea of a complete system did not crystallize into commercial form until the incandescent lamp was an accomplished fact. In other words, he had to demonstrate the light bulb worked, which he did to great fanfare, but he realized that merely inventing a light bulb was insufficient. You had to think holistically about the whole energy system. In other words, a light bulb is useless without a grid. Okay. This was Mr. Edison's competition, and believe me, if you read the history books, the competition was fierce. Gaslighting. Coal was gasified in gasifiers to turn it into methane gas, which was piped under the big cities of Europe and east coast of the US. There was even a coal gas gasifier here in Calgary on 10th Avenue South at one point. The gas was then piped into people's homes and factories, and then it was lit and in these lamps in the burners, and that was the dominant thing. So Mr. Edison's competition, at first blush, seems to be the lamp makers. Well, actually, no, because there's a whole series of entrenched interests along the whole supply chain of energy from beginning to end. So let's explore that. Explore that by mapping it out, mapping out how the joules of energy transit from the chemical form in coal, which is then gasified into the chemical form of methane, which is then put into a burner lamp, converted into heat and light is the end use that we want as a society. You always have to think about the end use. I told you about the car. The end use is mobility. The end use is not the car. You have to think about it as lighting. That's what you are trying to sell to people. And Mr. Edison understood that. And understood that he had to compete against the whole system and the whole route and all the companies that were on it. Because the companies that were on it had no interest in yielding the market share of joules to a newcomer and all of the others who then started championing light bulb production. So the coal to the steam engine was well established as a part of a paved route, we'll call it. It then had to be strapped to a dynamo or a generator to make electricity. The electricity had to be wired into homes and factories to the light bulb, and then we get light. So he understood that the little gray lines had to be made into big lines if it was going to compete. Energy transition. It's in the title and the theme. Energy transition is a rerouting of the joules of energy in society. In the business world, energy transition is competition for market share of joules. And this is so often quite lost on people because there's entrenched interests. And if you're going to get a fast acceleration, you have to have very clever people to compete who understand the resistance of the existing routes. We know the history. The light bulb and the grid became successful. It started out as coal, which was the dominant fuel at the time, but then spread into many more of the primary fuels. And now we try and get off the fossil fuels onto the renewables as part of the thing. Note that the mid-system infrastructure was also the most complicated for Mr. Edison, convincing people that we could dig up the roads, for example. From my personal collection of antique magazines on energy, Harper's Weekly, 1882, we can see the work that was being done around Wall Street. Side note, follow the money when you're commercializing. Paving a new route for joules, the joules that will compete with the established status quo. Drive down costs, scale up, think about the whole system. Holistic thinking, not just debating light bulb versus gas lamp. It's a whole system change. Well, I've given you the maps. Let's turn to mobility. How many ways can you turn a wheel? This is a photo I took, National Museum of Dublin in Ireland. Highly recommended. One of the oldest wheels in the world that's been from the Bronze Age. That question, how many ways can you turn a wheel? Well, the wheel was an accomplished fact a long time ago. Then some clever person said, hey, let's make a wagon and put it behind a horse. So this paradigm, the 1865 model BCE Cadillac. Also highly recommended. Go to the British Museum and see the Assyrian reliefs. And this is one of them. We see a very high-end chariot. This is a food-to-wheels system. You feed the horse turns it into kinetic energy, pulls the cart, and creates the mobility that we desire. 1957 Cadillac, sort of an icon of the age of gasoline power. Of course, it was developed much earlier, but the real golden age, the rapid adoption of vehicles was really post-World War II. And now 2024 Cadillac, an electric vehicle, and a hot seller at that, I'm told. So we have an evolution from food to wheels, oil to wheels, or well to wheels, to some renewable source of energy or other source of energy and electrical power, and all the conversions in between in that mid-system energy complex to turn the wheels, to give us the mobility that we desire. How many ways can you turn a wheel? Well, my team and I have mapped out over the course of the years, and this is about a quarter of the map. These are all the routes. I showed you the route from coal to gas lighting, and then coal and what Mr. Edison did. It seemed simple enough. But the number of ways you can turn the wheels, all the way from municipal wastes through biorefining down to wheels, oil to wheels, it's a tremendous number of alternatives. We have multiple primary energy sources, the incumbents and the fossil fuels, all the way to hydro, the renewable wind and sun You can do it from geothermal and nuclear, and the list goes on and on. Through conversion and all the nodes in the mid-system energy system, we can take those primary energy sources and turn a wheel. That is the mid-system infrastructure that I referred to that needs to be repiped and rewired, yet is the most difficult because it's so costly and amidst all the confusion, very difficult to make decisions around. If we look at the map on the petroleum route, well to wheels, there's all sorts of proposals out there. Sun to wheels via the hydrogen neighborhood. What does that look like? Well, it looks something like that. I can find you all sorts of different routes. The number of permutations, well, actually, let's explore the number of permutations. How many ways can you turn a wheel? So I've taken only a small part of my map. I've put it on the left with the primary energy sources, say wind, sun, coal, oil, gas, municipal waste, biofuels, and created what is a graph network, which is a mathematical representation of that map with all the nodes and the possibilities. For the mathematical geeks in the audience, I'll talk to you after. We'll have a good conversation. Said that there's formulas for figuring this out, and just in this simple graph network, there's 250 path permutations. 252, actually. This is only part of it. The number goes up factorially with a number of options. Well, you think about the people around that table and they're looking at this, and there's all sorts of people pitching them ideas. They're saying, well, you should take this route. And they're saying, well, no, I'm on this route. I'm not sure I can compete on that other route. Which one do I choose? I'm being told to decarbonize, but there's so many ways to turn a wheel or light a home or whatever. And so this leads to what we call choice overload, decision fatigue, decision paralysis. This is not something that I made up. You can actually read the academic literature that's out there in psychology papers. It's a real thing. And actually, I experienced it as I talked to many boards where there's basically decision paralysis. And the fundamental issue of, if I don't understand it, I ain't investing. If I don't understand the big picture, I ain't investing. So we try and help things along by putting road conditions, policy. We can overlay on the map a whole bunch of things. Let's overlay red lights. We want to create a burden on the fossil fuel routes, and we want to create incentives on the clean energy routes. So try and help the boardroom along, right? To try and limit the choices and say, okay, we're going to make it maybe easier for you. The strategy, which, by the way, is a very legitimate strategy and has been used effectively in other energy transitions I can show you, is to burden policies on the routes you want to get off of as a society and get onto the ones that support. But it has to be executed very precisely. Otherwise, you create societal anxiety. Anxiety at the kitchen table. Anxiety about affordability, about energy security, about all sorts of things. The number of policies on there is actually quite light, as I represent and I overlay them on the different nodes over the things. At the boardroom table, this is largely what people see, extending the traffic metaphor. I don't know which way to go. I'm confused. And further to that, we have political risk. Somebody's going to kick the sign down, right? Well, why should I go that way? These are the things that create uncertainty that cannot actually be quantified. If you can't quantify risk and return, don't invest. And it hinders the energy transition, which we're trying to accelerate in this room. How many times have you heard this statement? Follow the science. I've certainly heard more and more of it over the course of the last 10, 15 years. I'm a scientist by original training. I'm going, why are you putting the burden on people like me? Like, I thought this is a societal thing. Like, it's just a lot of stress and anxiety. But it's really, follow the science. it's really kind of patronizing, actually. I think we learned that lesson, like it or not, during the pandemic. Follow the science, just broadly speaking. And unfortunately, there's a lot of distrust of scientists and other people now, which gets back to that rebuilding of trust issue that we need. But there's too much emphasis, I would argue, on numbers, science, technologies, because the real issue is follow the behavioral science. Mr. Edison said that it's about attitudinal change in people. It's not about numbers and inventions and things like that. Right? And so the behavioral science are people like you and me, people who sit around the kitchen table, people who sit around the boardroom table. These are the people that make decisions, large and small. And again, if people don't understand what's going on, if their choices are overwhelming, and they don't think holistically about all those choices and go down rabbit holes, we lose trust, we lose confidence, and the investment does not follow into the transition. So as I wrap up, think about things you can do at the conference. Think holistically as you listen to all the talks. Don't listen to them individually. Well, listen to them, but try and put them all together in the big picture. Simplify complexity. If you're talking to somebody and you're a subject matter expert, say it in a way that people can understand. There is no dividend for talking jargon and complexity to somebody who doesn't understand it. And build trust through the process. What's great about getting together in person is that trust is now built in communities and interaction within people. And I'm really pleased to say we're getting much more back into the human-to-human connection face-to-face. This brings clarity. Clarity and openness instead of darkness. And clarity is certainly what I try and bring to decision-making tables. I want to conclude by telling you a little bit about the studio that me and my colleagues are setting up. Studio Energy. It's a place where people come to think. It's not a place to be told what to think. It's a place to come and think. We've got a bright space downtown Calgary where we are creating the tools and the techniques. We have a trusted place where professionals come to think creatively about the business of energy. The logo is the Newton's cradle where the ball is going back and forth. Conservation of energy, but also, in my mind, a metaphor for transferring knowledge from one to another. The red ball off to the side that you see everywhere on all my slides is try and think differently from the herd. Think for yourself, listen, think holistically, simplify complexity, and then come back and work with others. The spectrum I show on this photo that I took in Northern Europe, renewables to incumbents. If we don't think holistically and come together with all the routes and paths, we're not going to get very far. We just create congestions. We put up more traffic signs that block and frustrate society to the point where they don't trust anyone, and we don't get very far. The good news is, it seems like there are some simple solutions to this. It's not like we're trying to do really complicated technological things. Mr. Edison said, it is all about attitudinal change, working and convincing people to do things that they have never done before. We've got really cool projects in the studio, our Energy Road Atlas project, where we try and publish the routes, put them online. You're going to be able to click on all the little nodes. You're going to be able to overlay things like emissions to understand where the emissions are coming from in a holistic context. Those of you who were at my energy file presentation at Disruptors #1, we're going to continue that work. We're now expanding the vignette cards to include things that people can understand. For those who've never seen a gas turbine, kind of click on it and see where it sits in the route, and okay, now I get it. We're working on complex problems. Can policy be rated? This is a fundamental question because most people in the boardroom don't understand policy, don't understand how to put a number to the risk, to price it properly. It's complicated, but we're trying to simplify complexity so that we can get the money flowing again around the boardroom tables. We're modeling the flow of money in energy transition with these sorts of cool diagrams. What's interesting is I don't have to put up a single number to get a conversation going. And I know it looks complicated, but once you get talking, it comes together. It's really about thinking holistically about the system, and as I said, what Mr. Edison taught us, follow the money. Follow the money and see where it's blocked. If we can unblock where the money is clogged up, we can accelerate the transition. If you're in Canmore, come visit Elevation Gallery, where we've set up a small studio in the back and talks about the history of innovation and the light bulb in particular. There are so many lessons that Mr. Edison can tell us about. Well, we're not downtown Calgary in the thinking space. We're not in Canmore. We're here in this beautiful building that is just amazing. It also is a tremendous service to Calgary and will suit us well. So the takeaways, I hope, are fairly clear. Think about all what you hear in a holistic sense. Try and relate things to it. Talk to others. Talk in a simplified manner. Build trust through communities. Talk to people maybe that you would be unlikely to talk to. And maybe as a first call, trust them, even though you may know that you differ in your opinion with them. In fact, I think the biggest advice I can give you, try doing something you've never done before. Thank you.